Arsenal. He says here, Hopium, Arsenal, Feyenoord, Copenhagen, Antwerp. I mean, listen, when it comes to Arsenal predictions, what are you saying? Because again, a little bit like Newcastle and a little bit like Man United, people are writing Arsenal's Champions League hopes off. People are literally saying there's no chance, not happening. Arsenal are not doing anything in this competition. How do you see this Champions League campaign going for Arsenal?
I can see them having a good return to the Champions League. I think the fans are very happy. I think they will give them a lift as a club to be back in there. Players will step up. First time for players like Saka, Martinelli in the Champions League. I think they'll rise to the occasion. They've been wanting to do this for a few seasons now, and they're finally here. I think they'll do well. If you look at the teams in like pot 2 and 3, pot 3 and 4, I think Arsenal could beat all of them. Arsenal could beat all of them in those pots. So that is what your 6 points home and away. That's what 12 points. If they can beat those two, whoever they get from pot 3 and 4, that's them in the group stage. So I think they can do it. I think they'll be fine.
Yeah, looking at that again, I know what people will refer to. They'll say, well, what about Arsenal's Europa League performances last year? Well, their Europa League performances included rotating lots of their main first-team players out and giving fringe players an opportunity. In my opinion, that won't happen. That won't happen to the same degree this year. When I look at pot 3, genuinely, there's not a team in pot 3 that's as good as Arsenal. In pot 4, you could argue Newcastle, but they can't get them over 2 one-off games. But there's nobody in pot 4 that's on Arsenal's level. In fact, when you look at all the teams in pot 2, I would say only Real Madrid, you could argue, are better than Arsenal. I think Arsenal beat every other team in there if you were to ask people for their predictions. So it's all on paper. So they're one of the best teams in this tournament this year, Arsenal, when they're playing at their best. Now, what you have to factor in is how they cope with European football. The club doesn't have the pedigree and the heritage, and that does play a part. Fans handling the pressure on Champions League nights, knockout nights, the players almost not letting it get into their head that, our Champions League record, our European record isn't particularly great. They've got to learn to circumnavigate that. However, I just look at it and think, unless they get a real stinker of a group, and what's the toughest group they could get? You could argue Bayern Munich, followed by maybe AC Milan, followed by Sociedad, maybe. Even if they get the toughest group possible, Arsenal, in my opinion, are getting out of the group stages this year. I am so confident of that. Just like I am with Newcastle, I think Newcastle can do it. I think Man United will do it. And I think Arsenal as well will get themselves out of the Champions League group stages this year. I think their team is too good not to. Equally, just like with Man United, I do not buy into this early season hype that because they haven't started like a freight train, their season is over. It is far too premature. It is over the top. And it doesn't even, it beggars belief that people lack enough football knowledge to write top teams off after the first 2 or 3 performances of a season. Now, that doesn't mean Arsenal are winning it. But the way I've seen people talk online is as though Arsenal are not even going to get themselves out of the group stages. They're going to completely flop. I disagree completely. And if this Arsenal team starts to get some confidence in the Champions League, they can progress beyond the quarterfinals, in my opinion. Yeah. The English teams are so strong and are of such a high quality in European football compared to the majority of other countries. As long as they don't bottle it, they could go to at least the semi-finals, Arsenal, in my opinion. I really do think they can.
You got to remember as well, people bring up Arsenal's Europa League performances in recent years. It's never been the group stages that have struggled. It's always been the two-legged ties, semi-finals, final, the round of 16s. That's when they struggle. So to say, but look at their record in Europa League, that means they'll flop in the Champions League. Not in the group stages. They'll be fine in the group stages. They will have at least 2 teams who are not as good as them. in like guaranteed. Two teams are not as good as them. If you beat them both home and away, you're through. Then you've just got to manage how do you go about beating the team from pot one? How do you beat your Bayern Munichs, your PSGs, your Barcelonas? How do you get past them? That's the only thing they've got to really focus on in terms of the big challenge. But the other guys, I know Europe is hard. I know it's difficult, and these teams will rise to the occasion in Champions League night. But as long as Arsenal don't take things for granted, they could breeze through their group by beating the two other teams that are in their group.
What do you make of comments such as this that say that Arsenal's league form will drop this year because they have to play strong teams in Europe?
We said that about Man City, that because they're going to the Champions League final. Oh, that means they can't win the league, or that they'll be weaker because of it. No, we've just discussed 2 games a week for many players is what keeps them going, keeps a high level. This is what players live for. So I don't think their league form will drop because of the Champions League. Their league form will drop because they drop. You know what I mean? It's got nothing to do with another competition. It'll be all on them. There's no excuses for Arsenal to not perform well in both Champions League and in the league. They're that good. They're good enough. This isn't Newcastle. They're not Newcastle. We can argue that might have an effect on them. This isn't like Brighton, who are going to be in the Europa League for the first time, and or they've just made it to the Champions League for the first time, and they've got their small squad. This is Arsenal. Their form should be not affected by the Champions League.
I totally agree. And look, Arsenal, I think, will get out the group stages fairly comfortably. I think, look, Newcastle's, I don't think will be a whitewash. They're not going to walk away with 12 to 15 points. It'll be a lot closer. But I think they'll get out those group stages. There's no doubt. But again, people say things like, oh, their players are going to be tired or they might get injuries. How can they cope with both? You do realize that all clubs are going to be getting injuries. All the big clubs in England, barring Chelsea, and you could argue Tottenham, all the other teams in contention for top 4, including the Brightons and the Villas that are predicted to do much better this year, they're all going to be playing 2 games per week. And they're going to take the Europa League fairly seriously. All those teams are going to suffer injuries. What I don't like when it comes to Arsenal and Man United is the way in which people say, yeah, but what about when you get injuries? Well, what about when everyone else gets injuries? What about when everyone else has to play 2 games per week? The only 2 teams that potentially have an advantage are Spurs and Chelsea. However, like we said earlier, there is a train of thought that comes from the footballers themselves where they state they feel better, they feel sharper playing 2 games per week. They actually say there's less time to dwell on the upcoming games because you're spending all your time prepping for matches and then recovering. And just as you finish the other game and the recovery from it, you've got a day until the next match. And that's really, really key. We'll bring D-Man in soon. We just need balance. We just need the balance on the screen before we do it. We'll wait for the boys are going to be on soon before the draw starts. We've got some more comments that have come through here I want to put up. First one here says, United's transfer window is a shambles. No planning, no seriousness, only panic, panic, panic. Hope everyone is sacked after we get sold. Listen, again, I'm going to get called a Glazer supporter here. There is planning because Amrabat is a target the manager wanted. The execution's been terrible. Mount, Rasmus Højlund, and Onana, they were all targets we wanted. So there's been planning around who we want. The execution and the available money to the manager to get these deals over the line and the struggle of selling people, that is 110% on the owners and the board of the football club. So, Jay, I get where you're coming from, but I think there's some elements slightly wrong, but I get where you're coming from, bro. Was going to watch this on TV, but decided to support the channel. Love your unbiased views on things and just talk football and not narratives. Come on, you gooners. Thank you, Greg. And do you know what I'd say? Listen, you could have it on your TV and us. Do you know what I'm saying? You can do a little bit of both.
Just mute them, man. We don't want to hear their analysis.
Just mute it and react. Absolutely. Cedric here says Man United are 3 points up compared to this time last season. How is that a flop? Well, that's also, listen, if we lose this weekend to Arsenal, we'll be where we were for 4 games.
Basically the same.
But if we get a draw or beat them, then we're ahead of where we are. And that's what I'm saying. It's almost a case of people have got to slow down with completely writing off a team's season after 3 games. or overhyping it and saying we're winning things. And there was a comment earlier that says that Terry thinks that all the English clubs are going to win the Champions League. Saying that I think Newcastle and Arsenal and Man United will get out the group stages is not the same as saying I think they're going to win the Champions League. Are you sure Arsenal beat Inter and Atletico?
Yeah, they
I'm not
beat
sure.
Inter, let's go.
Yeah, I'm not sure they beat them, but I believe they've got a better team. There's a difference between saying they've got a better team and I guarantee 100% they beat them. They're different statements and different conversations. But in my opinion, Arsenal would get more of their players into those first teams than vice versa. Therefore, they have the better team. That's how I sort of define it. And I think as a collective, listen, Inter did really well in that final against City and could have done some business. Atletico, I don't think they're all that much cop at the minute, if I'm being honest with you. We saw what happened to the Spanish teams last year in Europe against listen, I know Liverpool got smashed up by Real Madrid on the counter-attack, but, you know, City kind of brushed them aside with ease. Look what Man United did to them in Europe, to Barcelona, in Europe. It wasn't that difficult. That's the best two teams. You start going further down that pecking order. I know we got beat by Sevilla.
Sevilla, let's get it right. Sevilla in the Europa League is not natural. It's not right. They get superpowers in the Europa League. I guarantee you, put Real Madrid, put Man City in the Europa League against Sevilla, and they'll still lose to Sevilla.
But in fairness though, Europe, Sevilla should have could have beaten City in the Super Cup. They just missed all their chances after going 1-0 up. So they are a good team, but yeah, listen, David De Gea and Maguire that night, that's what cost us. Arsenal's form tends to be good when involved in different competitions. In fact, the form drops whenever they get knocked out. Ironically, last year, Arsenal were better when they were in the Europa League than when they were out of it. So it's a very good point you've raised there. If Brighton won the Europa and Arsenal win the Champions League, people would still only say Brighton won in Europe first. I can see the tweets now.
Well, technically, they would have technically, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, they would be right. But remember, Arsenal fans, I don't get the Arsenal won nothing in Europe. They've won the Cup Winners' Cup. And I don't understand why that. I don't get why people don't accept that as a trophy. I do. Man United won it with Fergie.
It's just age, isn't it? Like we never grew up.
I suppose it's the younguns, isn't it? The younguns never saw it. It was finished as a comp before they were born. Yeah.
Yeah. Some of the kids don't know about the UEFA Cup. Obviously, it's the Europa League, but the UEFA Cup, boy, that used to bang.
Exactly. Nish, thank you very much for becoming a member. Jelly Spoon as well, and II Skills for all becoming members. Nish also with a super chat. He didn't say anything, but I appreciate it massively. We've got D-Man and Tom Little with us now.